Okay, so I'm very pleased to be back in Aalto-Yliopisto. It's been a while, certainly pre the pandemic, and I want to say particularly thank you to Anne-Marie Vanska and Guy Dulé for the invitation to speak, and also to congratulate them on the launch of Design Culture Research Group, and on the 20th anniversary also of the HILMA Network of Gender Studies. So my point of departure for this presentation, I hope for the conversation, is actually a paper I published in 2019, which was called Slow Plus Fashion, Women's Wisdom. That's where the Women's Wisdom title comes from. And it was published in a special issue of the journal Fashion Practice on design and sustainability, fashion design and sustainability. That paper builds on an earlier paper from 2008, which explored slow approaches as a way of establishing more ethical and sustainable fashion practice, and has led to a book which will hopefully come out next year. So that's my slow history. But in doing this work, and what drew me to sort of focusing on women, was an observation that there were significant contributions by women in slow praxis. And I would call out 5 distinct and important ways. In the production of work and systems that were substantially communal and shared. In initiatives where economic growth did not take precedence over concerns about overproduction and waste. Also in where values of the longevity of material garments took precedence over the production of short-term fashion looks. In recognizing fashion as personal agency and the everyday acts of dressing, designing, and making clothes, and in highlighting more caring practices of making, wearing, and conceiving what fashion is as clothing and what it does. But each of these, and especially the first, sat somewhere, as we've already almost heard, at the periphery of the mainstream global fashion system, and took place most consistently beyond, or at least in contention with, patriarchal hierarchies, and were not dominated in their origination or implementation necessarily only by the priorities of the global north. So a question arose as to whether there were forms of what I then called, and that was then, and maybe now, what I then called women's wisdom, which could contribute to more ethical praxis and, for the purposes of this conversation and talk, also could move between design and fashion. And I'm speaking about design and fashion somewhat independently for the moment anyway. So also recognizing that while both design and fashion must be contemplated relative to culture, to society, to agency, values, ethics, politics, they tend to be conceived and practiced, in my experience at least, professionally and institutionally in the academy, as distinct from one another. Maybe not at Aalto, but we can discuss that. And often as quite separate practices. And the practices themselves and their knowledge and how it is presented and conveyed change over time, of course, which is partly the focus of this paper, which will effectively begin with the 1970s and 80s and then move to the present. So to begin with a personal introduction, although Anne-Marie's just given me a very escalated one, and I thank her for that. So I speak to you as a cisgendered female academic who was involved in the beginnings of design history and design studies in the UK and the US, and then of fashion studies, also initially in the English-speaking academy. I've lived and worked in Britain, in Asia, in the US, and I now live in New York City and work there. So the fields of design history and design studies emerged as new areas of study, principally in art and design schools, certainly in the UK. And alongside the context of professional practice education of design, and the scholarship and pedagogy of design history, design practice, design studies mirrored traditional methods and approaches of art history. Essentially, initially anyway, the study of great works by great men in the West. But in the 1970s, of course, it was also a time of social, cultural, and intellectual change, including, not least, the impact of second-wave feminism, especially in Euro-America. One of the key feminist thinkers at the time was the French Hélène Cixous, who in 1975 proposed the notion of an écriture féminine, a feminine writing, as a means to recognize and identify how women express themselves outside of patriarchal structures. She states, quote, "Women must write herself, must write about women and bring women to writing. She must put herself into the text as into the world and into history by her own movement." Building on Cixous, I propose, can lead us to consider not only women's writing, but how and in what conditions designing broadly defined and material languages are created by women, for women, and of women. Cixous cautions, however, it's impossible to define a feminine practice of writing, and we can add design or fashion, which doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It will be conceived, she says, only by subjects who are breakers of automatisms, by peripheral figures, that's that word again, that no authority can ever subjugate. Of course, Cixous was not advocating for the establishment of a new canon of names, but rather for exploring these peripheries and dislodging dominant heteropatriarchal and white Eurocentric languages. Women's imaginary, she writes, is inexhaustible, but also she cautions that there's no general woman, no typical woman. The point of commonality for women is not simply identity, but repression under patriarchy. So a question for us here is, what and who is lost when knowledge production by women, for our purposes in design and fashion, is marginalized by patriarchy's impact on the social and cultural construction of womanhood and femininity? I'm arguing that there are at least three crucial losses, which include an anonymity and lack of awareness of persons, knowledge, practices, and not least of collaborative and collective work. Loss of indigenous and decolonial design and clothing practices and approaches, and also forms of devaluation of knowledge transmission other than writing, including oral testimonies, storytelling, performance, handmaking, community and care-based work. So building on the question, what are the forms of knowledge beyond heteropatriarchal white European languages of design and fashion, which might open up space for more caring and ethical praxis? And where does feminism have a role? And in posing that question, what terminology can and should we use? And how might that need to change to become more encompassing? For example, is woman an appropriate term? Is it deemed too essentializing today? Is it a term that needs to be revisited or redefined in order not to lose the wider feminist political agenda? So to help to move through some of these questions, I want to begin with some literature for the 1980s, as I said, and then move forward in time to the present, acknowledging the greater range of ideas and fields of study that have developed beyond the academy, including in fashion studies since the 1990s, all of which, again, is contextualized by culture and society, agency, value, ethics, and politics, which mirror shifts in the wider culture and in Europe, America, and beyond, including the decolonial debates. And how, to quote Cixous, as knowledge is uncovered, might there be possibility of change? Oh, that was strange. Oh, that's it. So I'm sorry, these are slightly blurry slides, but I'm beginning with 3 books, just as a touchstone, all of which, as you can see, share women in the title, and all of which were published in the 1980s, when the area of women's studies was, of course, ripe, later called feminist studies or gender studies, sexual diversity studies, etc., but this was the time of women's studies. So each book highlights women, highlighted the professionalization of design and making and of design studies and design history as emerging and already established areas of scholarship, but also point out the limitations of how knowledge was being shared. So the first, on the left, A Woman's Touch, was written by a specialist who had previously written about antiques, the decorative arts, and the arts and crafts movement. It was certainly a contribution to knowledge in that it brought women and their work such as the Russian designer here, Barbara Stepanova, out of the shadows, but often out of the shadows of a male designer spouse who still remain very much present in the book. And here in Stepanova's case, it was her husband, Alexander Rodchenko, who took this undoubtedly intended to be flattering picture. The book also took a canonical approach, which reinforced normative stereotypes about women and femininity. And the book's title, A Woman's Touch, was referencing the conventional trope of the feminization of the domestic space. The second book, just a few years later, Women in Design, was written by an American graphic designer then based in London, Liz McQuiston, with the aim to celebrate how women were contributing to the professional design field internationally, individually or working in teams with other women and men. Like A Woman's Touch, it was Euro-American-centric. While it wasn't intended to be a definitive collection, it included biographies and essays, and that was its format, of 43 designers, but only 2 were from Asia, none from Africa or South America, although the latter omission was noted. The author notes in her introduction that the presence of women had become apparent during the previous 5 to 10 years in all separate disciplines of design, although fashion wasn't included in her book, and there was only one textile designer, the French Nathalie du Pasquier. Similar to A Woman's Touch, fashion or clothing designers and makers were not foregrounded, although in A Woman's Touch, some designers such as Sonia Delaunay, who worked in textiles and fashion, were of course mentioned. So women had entered the design professions in design history and were being recorded, but it seemed very much on male terms. As British feminist design historian Cheryl Buckley wrote in 1976 in her still seminal paper, Made in Patriarchy, Towards a Feminist Analysis of Women in Design, which has been later updated, I quote, "Attempts like this one," and she was referring to A Woman's Touch, "to analyze women's involvement in design that do not take issue with gender, the sexual division of labor, assumptions about femininity, and the hierarchy that exists in design, are doomed to failure." The hierarchy. Maybe we'll come back to that too. So neither Women in Design or A Woman's Touch were grounded in feminism. And as Buckley went on to mention, a feminist critique of design must confront the problems of patriarchy, at the same time addressing itself to the exclusion of women in the historiographic methods used by design historians. She observed further that the monograph, the principal method used by historians to focus on the designer, is an inadequate vehicle for exploring the complexity, highlight complexity, of design production and consumption. The complexity was actually, to be fair, explored much more in the third publication, Women and Craft, which was edited, as you can see at the bottom of the cover image, by 5 UK-based women makers and writers, and contained 27 single and jointly authored short essays. The book documented how the practice of crafts had long been regarded as women's work, and how countless women had passed on skills such as sewing, quilting, weaving in the privacy of an essentially female community. Being informal and undocumented, theirs had been an almost hidden tradition. Any biographical information about the contributors to the book and the crafts people was folded into the essays. Today, we could conceive many of those featured as intersectional subjects, whose social identity, including their gender, race, class, sexual orientation, and abilities, overlapped and were part of their distinct experiences and practices. But as craft practitioners, they were written of separately from the professional practice of design and from its history. Fashion history was also written separately in the 1980s. As Buckley further noted, fashion, as an important area of design, is trivialized because of its association with women. It's seen as a marginal design activity because it caters to women's socially constructed needs and desires. For these reasons, design historians have tended to avoid the study of fashion, and maybe they still do, but to be discussed. So Some of the factors that distinguish these centuries of women's design work across cultures, and I'll call out three and come back to them. Certainly one was the centrality of textiles as a material, the importance of place where things were made, and the nature of the practices themselves, but I will return to that in a moment. So in the 1970s and 80s, just to sum up, sharing a feminist analysis of women in design needed new channels through which to share the knowledge of what women were doing, but also to recognize that women were not new to design practices. Much of the work had been going on for centuries, but without being considered design. In her essay, Shiksu criticized publishing houses as being powerful gatekeepers of knowledge with profit-driven motives. And we could maybe still talk about that today. But anyway, she writes that readers, managing editors, and big bosses don't like the women female sex texts. It kind of scares them. So as a result of these sort of gatekeeping aspects of sharing knowledge, sharing culture, in the period I'm talking about, women took knowledge production and dissemination about design and fashion and women's work into their own hands. Women in Craft began as an early issue of this magazine called Feminist Art News. This is actually the very first issue, which ran from 1980 to 1993 in the UK. It was a quarterly grassroots newsletter, each issue produced around a different theme and by a different production collective at the time, and it grew out of the Women's Art newsletter. The establishment of collective women-focused presses and publications were actually key to disseminating knowledge during second wave feminism. Writing the story of Virago, the British feminist publisher, started in London in 1973, and incidentally the publisher of A Woman's Touch and Women in Craft. One of its founders, Lenny Goodings, wrote of the many obligations and huge ambitions that the press set for itself to mirror the feminism and issues of the day, and commented how it was published always picked up the mood of the time. It was followed in the UK by the Women's Press, which, amongst many other publications, published this now, I'm sorry, fuzzy image on the left, but published this now much vaunted book by Rosika Parker, which has been recently republished, The Subversive Stitch, and also the Women's Press had this slightly quirky logo, which probably would not be used today, but we can come back to that too, maybe. But the Subversive Stitch was also a seminal piece of writing and research, drawing from household accounts, women's magazines, letters, novels, and stitched pieces. Rosika Parker demonstrated how embroidery was employed to inculcate femininity and to provide a way also to negotiate the constraints of the feminine role, and as well as providing an enormously pleasurable source of creativity, which also forged links between women. So to return to textiles as an important material historically and cross-culturally that has a firm and continues to have a firm place in women's production. Much of the work produced across the centuries has also had a strong relationship to place and especially the domestic environment. Buckley writes again how a sense of place increasingly informs feminist studies of women's lives and experiences. She also adds that how the theorization of female subjectivities must be situated in the contingency of one's own experience. And this is a point I'll return to towards the end. Similarly, feminist philosopher Rosie Braidotti has noted how, for feminist theory, the only consistent way of making general theoretical points is to be aware that one is actually located somewhere specific. Although, as we know, domestic-based textile work by women has meant that it has often been unknown and gone unappreciated, often because the work was produced on in a seemingly haphazard way. It was literally picked up and put down as other domestic obligations, childcare, family took over. But also because the knowledge involved was often not written down. It was oral knowledge. Quilting is a case in point. A traditional women's domestic practice fundamental to textile history in Europe, in the United States, in India, East Asia, which was being examined through a feminist lens from the 1970s and subsequently. Writing in 1973 in an essay, Quilts, the Great American Myth, Patricia Mainardi argued against a contemporary dismissal of quilts, which had been described as the non-creative, collaborative, repetitive, and anonymous efforts by amateur women at home. Mainardi goes on further to claim that assertions of the anonymity of women in many spheres were often the result of what she calls sloppy scholarship and a blatant disregard for women's work and women's culture. One example of this I'd like to share, which is a historical and a contemporary example, although similar examples exist across cultures, and I'm sure you're very aware of them, is these activities by this group of women called the Quilters of Gee's Bend. Gee's Bend is an isolated community in rural Alabama where direct descendants of women enslaved people who worked on cotton plantations established in the early 19th century still live and work. And today it's still an isolated community. It's literally in the bend of a river, which is accessible only by ferry or by one road. These quilters, as is commonplace with quilting traditions, principally pass on their knowledge through oral transmission or through what British feminist design historian Pat Kirkham has called learning by seeing. But the knowledge was fragile, or is fragile, and could be lost unless the practices continued, actually, as they have done in Gee's Bend now for 5 generations, and also using, in this community, found materials and passing along knowledge in families. The work was domestic. The quilters did work which also didn't translate into livable income. Their situation changed somewhat in the 1990s when an art dealer, Bill Arnott, visited the area and was apparently captivated by the quilts and bought literally hundreds of quilts, some of them quite used, from the women workers. And they, to quote press reports at the time, became a sensation. In 2002, a seminal exhibition, The Quilts of Gee's Bend, celebrating the legacy of 4 generations of the quilters, debuted at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And in 2003, the show moved to the Whitney Museum in New York, where, of that show, the New York Times reported some of the most miraculous works of modern art America had produced, as a description of the quilts. And the quilts also, I'm sorry, it's blurry, but on the right appeared on postage stamps. So the quilts were appreciated by the turn of the 21st century, but they were appreciated aesthetically. They were brought into the modernist canon, which was in itself interesting. And at the time, 20 years ago, this celebration did not translate into economic gains for most of the women in the community, many of whom were the sole breadwinners and with very low median household incomes. Finally, in 2010, the same collector launched a foundation called Souls Grown Deep, which now has set up a situation where some of the work is copyrighted, the work is available on Etsy, and it's also priced relatively reasonable. So the women finally have been given professionalism and agency without commercial exploitation for their work. And that has also given them empowerment within a family situation as well as more personal freedom. So the quilters also have provided an interesting example, certainly through another recent example, of this potential for collaboration between, if you like, crafts, making, and fashion. They contributed this, what in America would be called a vest or an overcoat, to this collection by Gabriela Host for Chloe in autumn-winter 2022. So it was an interesting example of working with a much more famous, but also ethically focused female designer, and also a way that the principles of quilting, certainly for warmth, but also principles of longevity for quilting was being built effectively into this fashion item. So women working with other women, even if they're coming literally from different places and from different intersectionalities, can also provide a sense of recognition and safety for those involved. Hélène Cixous expressed similar sentiments when she wrote quite poetically about garments, the garment she wore as designed by the French designer Sonia Rykiel. Cixous commented on how Rykiel's soft knitted garments created a continuity of the body and a strong sense of identification for her. For her, going to Sonia Rykiel was going to a woman, and thus going home. Political theorist and feminist Iris Marion Young has also emphasized in her writing how women can have pleasure in clothes, and I think it's important to keep the pleasure principle present. And pleasure afforded by wearing and by touch, not afforded through being subjects of the gaze, as is often the case in our fashion representation. Young also noted how in her own experience, clothes could also bridge differences of race and class and sexuality between women, and how she had found it in her own experience easier to bridge cultural differences by talking about elements of women's culture, often clothes. Young also referenced French feminist Luz Irigaray in observing that feminine desire moves through the medium of touch more than sight. And she defines touch as a tactile imagination, and this word imagination keeps coming through. That's that specific sense of skin on matter, fingers on texture, and also as an orientation to sensuality, which includes all of the senses. And finally, another reference, the writer Constance Classen, in her anthology, The Book of Touch, references the sheer pleasure and comfort experienced by women of wearing clothes, as well as the invitation offered by garments to be imaginative and to play with identities. So, considering the imagination and also thinking about epistemology and knowledge and what we know and how knowledge is conveyed, I now want to move us forward to the present day, and I also want to focus with a couple of examples on the area of museums and exhibitions, because in my experience in fashion studies in particular, in fashion, certainly in the 21st century, there's been an explosion of fashion-related exhibitions for many and various reasons. But I want to share with you, as an example, one of these. So this exhibition was held last year at the museum, the Metropolitan Museum, the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And it was an exhibition that had been a long time in the making and conception, partly to do with the pandemic. But nevertheless, the aim was to highlight the anonymity, lack of visibility, agency, and absence/omission of women from history. And if you recognize the piece on the right, you might wonder, as I did when I went into the exhibition, why with this exhibition of women designing for women, featured very near the start of the show was this very famous dress by the Italian Mariana Fortuny, the Delphos dress. The reason for showing it, and of course the famous sort of secret pleating technique. The reason for showing the Delphos dress, the exhibition shared, was that recent knowledge had uncovered that the pleating technique used by Fortuny was actually created in collaboration with his wife, Henriette Nygren, but had her presence in the technique had been lost because of it being omitted, her name being omitted from the original patent registration. So just an interesting example of, how much we know and how we find out. The female curators of the exhibition, Karen van Gotsenhoven and Melissa Huber at the Costume Institute, stated from the outset, it should be said, that their objective was to recognize and celebrate women, not to essentialize women. And Gotsenhoven, in her catalogue essay, also referenced Cixous's notion of a feminine writing, moving from writing of the self to thinking about garments and material languages that can be both read and worn by other women. And somebody asked me recently why this exhibition was women dressing women, not people, which is a good question, but one of the reasons was there was obviously an intention there, but also it was a reflection of the fact that the show drew substantially from the permanent collection of the Costume Institute, which is a collection of largely of women's clothing donated by women across time. Some pieces, however, were acquired specifically for the show, and one of them was the piece we've already seen in the middle there, the Chloe Giesbend vest. One of the others we can see here, second from the left, was commissioned from Jamie Okuma, who is a Native American designer. And then we also have a piece on the far left from the collection from American designer Yo Lee. You'll probably recognize, third from the right, the piece, the collaboration from Maria Grazia Giuri and Grace Wales Bonner. And then I'll talk about the piece second from the right, and the piece on the far right was Maureen Sayre, just for a point of reference. But the show also tried to emphasize, and actually did emphasize, how much, as Buckley noted, design is, whatever the design, is a polysemic process. And for garments, it also emphasized, which is also important and sometimes forgotten, how the design also involves wearers. How items are worn and by whom is also very important in that ongoing life of fashion and clothing, which may be partly another factor that may be distinguishing it from other areas of design practice, but to be discussed. One piece was, the piece wasn't commissioned for the show. The actual outfit was designed by New York designer Hilary Taymor, who has the brand Colina Strada, and had appeared in her autumn-winter 21-22 collection as being worn by the transgender femme disabled model Erin Rose Phillip. And here we see the model and Hilary Taymor on the right. The Met had a custom-made mannequin commissioned and made, it was made in Italy, completely made from Erin Rose Phillip's body, and then this wheelchair also, which I think the wheelchair had appeared in Hilary's show as part of the exhibition. So this also moves us on, I think, to thinking about who and what is left out, and certainly the acknowledgement of disabled bodies by fashion designers, by design, and really in society more broadly was until recently, and certainly where I come from, a taboo, and also beyond sort of particular practices, can we say, in design and fashion, which still gave a primacy to modernist-driven aesthetics and to patriarchal hierarchies. Another subject which perhaps curiously has also been omitted from design attention, fashion attention, which I just want to cite as a comparable example. This exhibition was also, I think, trying very hard to give a much more sort of thoughtful-based focus, to have a strong concept for the exhibition. Similarly with this exhibition, which also tackled another taboo subject, curiously taboo subject, the example of motherhood. which I think is, was a very important focus, because as the curators stated, design is at the heart of human reproduction. This project began and at the time it was completely unaccounted for, certainly in design history in the United States. It began in 2019 and was very much, and is very much, it's ongoing, a collaborative project, which involves designing, but also brings us into that realm of storytelling. It was a major collaboration, not only, but substantially by Michelle Miller-Fisher, who is the curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and had actually been working on the history of breast pumps, with Amber Winnick, who's a freelance design historian who'd been working on the history of maternity wear, and Takera Gainey, who is a doula based in Philadelphia, as part of the Maternity Care Coalition. So this was a project which I got to know about first because I knew Michelle Miller-Fisher, and she was working on it, but it was a project that couldn't find a venue. Although she's a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, they wouldn't take the show, and she was literally hawking this show around. Eventually it found a place, its first venue, and it's since been moving to other places, was in Philadelphia, but at the Muti Museum, which is a medical museum. So it was interesting, and it's since moved to Boston, to Houston, and I think it's just currently opened in Stockholm, but we'd have to check that. So the show is now established, it's moving, it's traveling, there's a book you can look at. But it was touching on a subject that is essential to all of us. We've all been born, and touching on intersectional stories, but was also very much not considered appropriate, maybe for major museums, certainly. Garments were not featured, but they're included. For example, this garment on the left, and we call it the mid-century game changer, was because I took this image from a talk which the curators were giving, which were talking about this garment as a game changer because it was actually designed for maternity wear. And also the image on the right was from a popular US and English-speaking world TV show in the 1950s, where for the first time the comedian Lucille Ball appeared on her show, being pregnant in real life and being pregnant on the show, so game-changing in various ways. But just, again, reminding us, or maybe drawing attention to what we know, what we don't know, but what we also share in public. The exhibition also acknowledged pregnant people, not only pregnant women, and focused on care and caring. This is from the catalogue, or from the book. And giving acknowledgement and value to care and caring, topics which should be at the heart of design and its relationship to human well-being, but often are not. Which takes us back to my original question and is bringing me towards the conclusion, and to more importantly to the discussion. So, to go back to the question, what are the forms of knowledge beyond heteropatriarchal white European languages of design and fashion which might open up spaces for more caring and ethical praxis? And where does feminism have a role? And also, more crucially, how has the discourse changed since the 1970s and 80s? And what sort of knowledge is being produced by women and shared today? So to bring us to a conclusion, I offered two possibilities. There are many, but I offered two possibilities of more recent writing. This is from Lauren Fournier's book, Auto Theory. I can tell you a little bit about auto theory and then come to the quotation. So it was a mode of contemporary post-1960s artistic practice, that's indebted to feminist writing, art, and to activism, and marks a shift from the work of feminist precursors like Hélène Cixous, but at the same time builds on her feminine writing but Fournier and others using practices of women's writing as a way of distancing themselves from masculine logic and signification. Fournier was herself influenced by lesbian feminist Nicole Brossard, whose fiction théorique, or fiction theory, is an experimental writing practice producing collectively authored texts, which integrates philosophy and feminist writing with autobiography and fictionalization. But this also reminded me very much of in fashion studies, very recent or more recent work, where clothing ethnographies, autoethnographies, wardrobe stories, or telling stories, and a more expansive range of research methods have become much more common. So, as Fournier says, auto-theory is important because it troubles any easy recourse to the theory versus practice, or art versus life, or maybe design versus fashion divide, if indeed there is one to be discussed. So, building on this, I also wanted to mention the possibilities for feminist analysis offered particularly by storytelling, and to highlight a recent memoir, which is literally just out a couple of months ago, by Céline Seaman, who is a cultural anthropologist who runs the Slow Factory, which is a New York-based environmental and social justice organization. She's a war survivor and child refugee, originally from Lebanon, then in Canada, and then in the United States, but who in this concept and this book shares endangered and discredited ancestral knowledge from the Global South, which is communicated through a tradition called Hakawati, which is basically the storytellers of the Levant, holding indigenous knowledge and wisdom, which she herself shares. For example, wisdoms involving healing, using herbs, using natural processes. And she argues in this book, and her premise is that when you are teaching a woman, you are really teaching her entire community. And for our purposes, as a way of bringing us to a close, she also interestingly defines a woman and maybe enables us to use this term in a way that was certainly different from the 1980s and in a way that makes us comfortable today. So woman, noun, to be a human who identifies as a woman regardless of the nation-state's definition of femininity and without limitation of gender norms imposed and established under patriarchal colonial rule. So for our purposes, I think this book, to finish, highlights knowledge creation and sharing by women, but also addresses that not uncomplicated word, woman, with a definition that hopefully will lead us fluidly into our discussion. It brings us back to that bigger project for today and for all of you going forward, feminist border crossing in fashion and design, or together or apart, which I sum up as being about unearthing praxis and sharing knowledge, of confronting and creating dialogues within and across cultures, of constantly troubling and questioning, which will move us together from the past through the present and into the future. And that is the power, I think, both of feminism and of design. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hazel, for your wonderful speech. I think there is time for 1 to 2 questions before we move on to the panel. So, anyone willing to pose a question for Hazel for her wonderful talk? Just raise your hand. Oh, there's one question at the back, over there.
have a question. I was thinking because, as you showed earlier, the exhibition that took place with different like fashion designers and things like that, and also the books that you showcased now, could you maybe recommend an artist or a writer that maybe writes more about women in American, like Native American cultures? Because I think it's something that I've been trying to like figure out more about, but it's not really easy to find. So yeah, and especially since Native American culture has like its own definition of being feminine or like and being trans or two-spirit, as I am as well. So I was thinking, do you know anything?
I don't. I have to admit, I can't recommend. But you know, I think you're highlighting the problem. You know, that there's still work that needs to be done, and a lot of that work is shared and is shared orally. I have a colleague, Soraya Park, who's working on this now, but she hasn't written anything. So yeah, exactly. You know, but it's kind of crazy, but. There's just so much work still to be done. I'm sure there is work actually. And I'm sure it can be found that's written, but that's still a major project. Like this is part of a major project. So sorry, really unhelpful answer.
Yeah, no. I was just trying my luck, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you. What about here in front?
Hi, thank you for the keynote speak. It was really wonderful. I'm an alumni from Aalto. I'd like to, I don't know if it's a question, but this kind of came to my mind in the keynote that there is this kind of communal thing that is kind of underlining the whole thing. It's in the kind of guild makers that you were saying, and even in this like learning by seeing that there is this like communal thing going on. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If I didn't emphasize that enough, that you're absolutely true. I mean, absolutely. And I think, we're so also in the academy, we're so obsessed in recording. It goes back to the previous question. Recording through the names of individuals. I mean, men, but it can be women as well. And we have difficulty capturing communal activities. Not just doing them, but capturing them, because there's this sort of obsession, particularly through the old art historical model with authorship and individuals. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's hugely important, particularly for textile work, but absolutely not just for textile work. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
Hello, thank you for a beautiful, beautiful talk, and very interesting, lots of things to learn. I was wondering, after this last question, and also when you were speaking about the quilts, if this translation between the culture of the oral learning and so on, the oral tradition and the communal practices, when they are translated and captured into a book or captured into a collection, if it also changes the essence of what it is, of what this knowledge is, and therefore, in a way, sort of colonializes it.
Sure.
Colonizes
it. I mean, absolutely, that's a danger, and sort of fixes something. I think it was interesting with the G's Bend example that, in the one hand, it sort of fixed the work as art, it artified, but on the other hand, later on, it was interesting, there's kind of a 10-year gap between these major shows at the beginning of the 21st century, and then the women having this kind of support system set up for them. But then it also, that knowledge about what they were doing also enabled them to make a living wage, because when they were selling their quilts originally to a wider world, they were literally pricing them at a kind of crazy price. So I think it's kind of doing both. But yeah, you're right. And also they became known because they were seen to be artistic, and on postage stamps. But, it did have the plus side for them, that, they did get a living wage, and, and also interesting in the process, they started to value their own work. So it's a kind of mixed thing, but yeah.
Any other questions? There is one still.
Still.
Hi, I'm actually building on the previous comment. Is like, do you think that the value of craft versus the value of art, like, is it possible to kind of uplift the woman's craft without bringing it to this like art plane?
I mean, I think it is, but I think it often, as with the publishers I mentioned, I think it often needs like a different space, a parallel space. It was, for example, interesting with that motherhood exhibition, which is not exactly what you're talking about, but it took so long to find like a small venue, but then when it was actually staged, it was recognized that this was something really interesting and important. So then, it sort of grew. But I think sometimes it's got to be through, alternative or different spaces. Partly because, big institutions, museums, etc., are just so good at gatekeeping. But so it can and does happen. And so, and sometimes it also, those things kind of lapse and then they come back. So, yeah, it's just got to keep doing the work.
Thank you.
Hello. Also on my behalf, thank you for the inspiring talk. I'm Oona. Now starting my master thesis process. And I've been sort of juggling around ideas on gender. Mm-hmm. And on this keynote, I was wondering, and with the last slide also, that what do you think is the purpose of highlighting these identities or these gender identities still? Because I believe that especially in queer studies, we're moving forward in thinking that maybe the healing doesn't or wouldn't occur within these identities, or because they, in their essence, are they have a possibility and tendency to capture people and also cast out people who do not fit those categories. And I wonder, even in this definition, even though the writer says that without limitation of gender norms imposed, then why is it still important to have that definition of a woman? And how do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. I think that's like the subject of the discussion, really. because you're absolutely right in what you're saying. I think that's why I wanted to leave you with this book, which is very recent, and it provides this very interesting, maybe provocative definition for us, because is using woman now seen as too essentializing? Well, it is by many people, and I think it's very interesting that this particular author was comfortable with that term, as a political position. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, is it better to have one overarching term, or is that ever possible? I think that's the problem. It isn't actually ever possible just to have the one overarching term, because even if we use the word queer now, it's sort of depends who's saying the word and listening and where we are. So I think what's more important is defining what we say and when we're saying it. And that was my point. That when we're using a term is crucial, the time and place, because that differs too. But you're also right. It's not without its problems. All I say is we've got to be very conscious of the terms we use and how and why we're using them, and at what particular moment in time.
So do you believe that maybe then thinking about situatedness rather than like identity is maybe more? I mean,
I do think in this moment in time, and maybe we're coming out of it, we have become very, very fixated with identities.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a bit of a kind of weight on us now. And and I think that's the problem. A lot of these issues, once we start talking about them, the kind of first sort of point of reference is to do with identities, and there's sort of, and there's a lot more than identities, and I think that's also where we are as well. And I know Anna Maria's one of her questions, which I absolutely didn't mention, but was making me think about the whole realm of not just the digital, but of course social media, and the kind of flat world we live in as well. Now that flat world of screens and communication is also so identity fixated, as we know. So, that's the moment we're at too. But it's not an easy one.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.